Welcome to today's customer-exclusive webinar, Introduction to the Genesys API. My name is Alan Dawes, and I will be your host during today's webinar, presented by Andy Dodson. We're excited to show you how to start working in the Genesys API. Andy Dodson has been with the Genesys development team since release 2.0 and has authored, updated, or scratched his head over code in most parts of the architecture. He's a big fan of the Genesys API and its ability to integrate applications across the enterprise, which offers the potential to leverage and fine-tune system investments to best meet organizational needs and goals. He's performed in a variety of systems development and project management roles for 18 years, mainly within the Microsoft .NET framework and SQL Server environments. Before Andy gets started, I have just a few housekeeping items. We will be answering questions today at the end of the presentation. Please send your questions in as soon as you think of them through the question tab on the webinar control panel. Andy will answer as many questions as he can today, but if we do not get to your question, we will reach out to you after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded today. If you experience connection problems during the live presentation, you will be able to access the recording in the My Support area of the Vitech website. If you have any questions regarding the recording, please contact us by emailing support@vitechcorp.com. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you would like to see covered in future webinars. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Andy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Alan, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Indeed, today we are going to be talking about the Genesys API. Now, today is a introduction to the API. In just one sec, I'm having a couple of technical difficulties advancing my slide, but there we go. Okay, so today is an introduction to the API. So we're not going to get into a whole lot of technical depth. And instead, the goal is try to provide a good starting point, a good conceptual understanding of what the API is and what it does, so folks are off to a good start with developing API applications. So to those ends, we are going to be covering a couple things. First off, we are going to provide an overview of the API. Next, we are going to be touching on some getting started topics or prerequisites, what it takes to get started writing an actual application. And then lastly, we are going to geek out with y'all a little bit and take a look at some code for an actual API application running against a live version of Genesys. One quick caveat in terms of the code demonstration, and that is I'm not going to be getting into a whole lot of detailed programming instruction. We're actually going to run through the code pretty quick, with the idea being, again, getting a more conceptual overview of the API. I know there may be some developer folks out there, some folks that don't write software, and I don't want to kind of muck things up with a detailed programming instruction. So we're going to run through this pretty quick. Please remember the idea is to get a conceptual overview of the capabilities of the API rather than specific programming instructions. So if you're a developer, you're welcome to holler about that with me later. And if you're a non-developer, you can go ahead and perhaps thank me later, and I'll try to walk the line down the middle here. So, okay, so in terms of a high-level overview of the API, I think the primary takeaway is probably that the API is a fundamental part of the architecture. Okay, it's built into the architecture, as opposed to perhaps a add-on or a wraparound for the architecture that exposes particular points within it. Instead, the API is fundamentally built into the architecture. It was an original goal of Vitech during the initial Genesys design and requirements planning to ensure we provided a fully functional application programming interface so folks, Genesys users, could potentially fully integrate that Genesys data across your organization. Okay, so the API is a fundamental part of the architecture. One implication of that is that given it's not kind of a bolt-on to the architecture, you may find that the API is perhaps a little more intuitive to use a little smoother, a little simpler to use than other API applications that you may have worked with that are more wrappers around the architecture. Okay, well, given that the API is indeed a fundamental part of the architecture, one thing that means is all of the tools, the front-end tools that we create and deliver to you guys here at Genesys are actually built using the exact same API methods and properties that are available to you all. So we actually use the API to deliver these tools that you may be familiar with here at Vitech. So we do indeed eat a healthy mouthful of our own dog food when it comes to the API. We develop our apps using it. Okay. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of API functionality? Given that the API is indeed a fundamental part of the architecture, what that means is you have full control over your model programmatically. Or in other words, you have full create, read, update, and delete abilities against your model, modules, and that includes both the data side of your projects, okay, as well as the schema side of your projects. So you can get as dangerous as you want here. You have full create, read, update, delete abilities against all the data in your projects, and you can bounce up to the schema side of your projects and work with those as well. So it's kind of simple. API is fundamentally built into the architecture, and it provides full create, read, update, delete capabilities for all parts of your models. Okay, so how do we get started? If we're gonna write an API application, what are a couple prerequisites? Well, to start with, kind of a no-brainer here. We need at least one running Genesys install, and by that I mean we need at least one running Genesys service. So API applications are actually going to connect to the Genesys services that are running out there. Okay, so that's thing one. We need a Genesys install up and running out there. Number two, we need a development environment to write our .NET app. Now, Genesys is a Microsoft .NET 4.0 product, which means if we're going to write an API app against it, we're going to be writing a API application, a .NET application to create that API app. In terms of development environment, .NET development environments out there, primarily what you can see is Microsoft Visual Studio. That's their mainstream product for .NET development. There are some third-party products out there, but when it comes to commercial development, you're primarily going to see Microsoft Visual Studio. That's the second thing we need here is a .NET development environment. The third thing we're going to need is we're going to have to grab a handful of Genesys DLLs. Those DLLs encapsulate the API, and those DLLs are what we're going to access to gain the methods and properties that we're going to need to interact with a Genesys installation, a Genesys service. We can find those DLLs in any Genesys installation directory, typically perhaps program files. So we can hop in there, grab a couple DLLs, reference them directly from our API app, or perhaps copy them out, put them in a directory of your choice, and we'll reference them from there in our API app. Okay, lastly, we are going to need our Sentinel licensing service running. Sentinel is, of course, Genesys, the licensing mechanism for Genesys, and an API app is going to have to ping that to ensure it has proper access into a Genesys install. We, of course, don't want any apps to be able to connect to your Genesys data. Okay, so kind of straightforward there. So if we bundle together a couple things here, a .NET development environment, we're going to go out to any Genesys installation directory, probably program files. We're going to grab a couple Genesys DLLs, which we'll reference in our API app. And lastly, we need that Sentinel service running, which is available in any of the Genesys installers. And once we've gathered these things together, we are ready to rock and roll and begin connecting to a Genesys service. One quick note here, I may use a couple terms analogously. When I say Genesys install or a running Genesys service, or perhaps a repository, I'm referring to the same thing. I'm referring to a Genesys install. So Genesys install, a Genesys service, or perhaps you may hear me call it a repository that's out there. So that's what we need to get started. Not a whole lot there. Let's go ahead move on to the next screen, and we are going to go ahead. I'm going to turn my cap around to my pointy-headed development cap, and let's geek out a little bit with some code. And we are going to look at a actual API application running against a running Genesis service. And the one I'm going to hit is one that just happens to be running locally on my machine here. Now, I think what you'll find with the API is it does kind of follow a Pareto rule, okay? What that means, you can probably learn about 10 to 20% of the techniques and methods in the API and do 80 to 90% of the stuff you'd ever like to do. So by learning a couple key methods, you can do a whole lot of stuff, okay? So that's what the code demonstration is going to cover, and that's going to be kind of that key 10% of the API, okay? Let's go ahead and take a look at that. I am going to pull up Visual Studio here. So here I have Microsoft Visual Studio, and it's loaded up with some code. We have our API application loaded into Genesis. Name of that API app is Intro to Genesis API. And the first thing we may want to notice is the assemblies or DLLs that are project references. And we see our Genesis DLLs down here. So there we go. Those are the Genesis DLLs that we touched on in the Getting Started or Prerequisite section. See, these are the DLLs. We're going to head into a Genesis installation directory, pull them out, and reference them in our API app. And those DLLs encapsulate the API, give us access to all the functionality within it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hide this. And let's start looking at the code. Okay, now again, I'm not going to do this from kind of a programmatic construction point of view, a developer to developer assumption. I know there's probably folks on here who aren't developers, and I don't want to clutter up the works with getting into detailed programming instructions. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly with the idea again. Please look at this as I go through it as kind of getting a conceptual understanding of the key capabilities of the API. Okay, so before we need to begin accessing a project and its data, there's a couple things we need to do. Actually, three things we need to do. We need to get an entry point into the API. Then we need to access the repository and log into it. And then from that repository, we need to get the project of interest. Okay, let's go ahead and go through those things. So to get an entry point into the API, all we have to do here is create an instance of what we call client model. Client model is a type in the Genesis API. To get that entry point into the API, we simply new up, if you will, a client model, and behind the scenes, that's going to kick off some startup stuff in the API side that's going to be needed. So we're through thing one. We have that entry point into the API. Next thing we do is we need to access. Sorry, I'm working on a new keyboard here and fat finger a little bit here. So the second thing we need to do is we need to connect to a repository. Well, that starts with knowing where that repository is, where that Genesis installation is. So we need some connection information that gives us a pointer to where that running Genesis service is. And we do that through a type here called repository configuration. That's a fancy way of calling something like IP address. Okay, so we can think of a repository configuration as essentially like an IP address, or in other words, the connection information to a running Genesis service that's out there. Okay, now we can go ahead and get a list of repository configuration objects or connection objects to different Genesis services by heading into our client models. We see on the far right there, client model that we just established in the line above. We're going to call a method called getKnownRepositories. It's going to give us a list of those connection information objects to Genesis services. And the first one in that, let's do it this way. My new keyboard is getting me here. The first one in our list of repository configurations by default is going to be the connection information to a local repository or a local running Genesis instance. instance. Now, .NET is a uses zero-based indexing. So to get the first thing in the list, we use 0. The first thing in our repository configuration list that we got from our client model, again, is going to represent, by default, a connection to a local Genesis install, a local Genesis service. Next thing we're going to do here is we're going to write some stuff to the screen of our API application. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and fire up this API app, and let's take a look at it. I'm going to start it up. And so here we go. Here's our first screen in an API app, basic login screen. Enter your username, enter your password. I've pre-populated them simply for brevity's sake. And we're going to write in the name of the repository that we're going to try to connect to, which is what we see right here. Okay. Now, when we click our OK button here, that's going to attempt to log into our repository. So let's take a look at our event handler for our OK button. Let me turn back to Visual Studio here, and let's head down to our OK button click method, or our click event handler. So we're in our OK button, and we are still on thing 2 of the 3 things we need to do. The first thing being get an entry point to the API. That was done with the client model when we created that. Now we want to go ahead and log into a repository of interest. And we see here our repository configuration for our connection information. Think of it as IP is the easiest way to think about it. From that repository configuration, we are going to call, pretty simple method here, we're going to call login. And we're going to give that login method credentials, some Genesis credentials. And we see those credentials created in the line just above here. Okay, so we simply create a new instance of a Genesis client credentials here, and we simply pass in the username and our login screen as entered by the user, the password as entered by the user into our client credentials object, and we are now off to the races with a good credentials object containing username and password. So once again, back to our repository configuration, log in, give it those credentials, and we're rocking and rolling. Okay, we have now logged into that repository. Now, just real quick, in a regular commercial app around our login call, there's going to be some handling in case your username or password was bad, where we're going to pop up some message boxes to the user, ask them to try again. But just for brevity's sake in the code, I'm not including that standard kind of handling. Okay, so we are now through thing 2 in terms of being able to begin working with the project in a particular Genesis install. We've got an entry point into the API with client model. We've gotten some connection information for different installs out there. We have used one of them to log in, and we're now ready to go. We are logged into a Genesis install. So the next thing we want to do, what we're trying to do here is we need to get to a project of interest. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take that repository configuration that we just logged into, simple method called get repository. That's going to return us a repository object. Now that repository object represents we already had a root access point into the API. Now we're looking at a root object called repository that is the root object to all the data in the Genesis install that we are connected to. So root data object to the entire Genesis install. We're going to take that repository, since it's a root data object, we want to get some data out of it. In this case, you want to get project. You want to get project, repository, get project. All we need to do, pass in the name of the project of interest. That's going to return us a programmatic project object, which is now the root data object to all the data in a project. And so that's all we really need to do to access the Genesis install, connect to it, and access the project that's in it, so we can work with that project data. Last little bit of code here doesn't have anything to do with the API. That's just launching the next screen in our API app. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to pull up our running API app. We're going to click OK. Execute our code here that's going to log into our repository. So OK, 3, 2, 1, and there we go. We have now logged into the repository and accessed the project in it. called Intro to Genesis API, and we're ready to go. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the main Genesis client so we can take a look at the data we're going to work with from our API. So I have a very simple project in here called Intro to Genesis API. That's the one we just accessed. In our project, we have a couple components. Our root components folder. We have a subfolder, which also contains a couple entities. Our subfolder is called built from. And shockingly, our entities in our built from folder are going to be related to our components in our root component folder via the built from built in relationship definition. That's what we got. Here's the data we're going to be working with in our API app. Okay, so here comes the API app back up in the foreground here. So let's start working with it. The first thing we want to do here is we want to fetch some data and display it. Let's go ahead and look at our display button. Look at the software behind that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up Visual Studio again. So here we go. And I'm going to move over to our second screen here that we were just looking at and look at how this works. So again, right now we're working with the display button click event. And what we're doing here is we've kicked our software that fetches data and displays it. We've encapsulated it into its own method down here. And the reason we did that is after we perform our subsequent operations, create some data, update some data, delete some data, we're going to call this same method here in order to display the changes to the model as we update it. Okay, so let's look at our get and display data method here. Okay, the first thing we're going to do up here is we are going to grab a sort block, a standard Genesis sort block. Okay, and the reason the way we're going to do that is we're going to hop into our hardworking root project object, which once again gives us access to any data in the project. So project get sort block, fairly intuitive call there, and then we're going to give it a constant representing the sort block that we're interested in. So in this case, project get sort block, give me the numeric sort block. We've now returned a programmatic object, a sort block that we're going to put to work in just a minute here. Okay, now let's go ahead and fetch some data. Now to fetch some entities, we are going to start with the folder that the entities of interest belong to or live in. And the way we're going to do that, once again, we're going to head back to our project object. We have a method here called getFolder, which shockingly is going to return us a folder of interest. And for getFolder, we simply provide the name of the root folder we're interested in. So project getFolder is then going to give us a programmatic folder object representing that folder that we can begin working with. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to fetch a folder. In this case, we have fetched the root components folder. Next thing we're going to do here is we're going to take that folder. And on the far right of that highlighted line, the folder type has a method called getEntities. Shockingly, that's going to return all the entities in that folder. Okay, so folder getEntities is going to return us an entity list of all those entities in that folder. Okay, so we now have some entities and we're ready to rock and roll in terms of getting some data. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to enter a standard loop here, standard for each loop. And here we see our numeric sort block get put to work. So our sort block has a method called sort entities. We simply give it an entity list. In this case, it's those root components we fetched. And that's, of course, going to sort that list by the criteria of the sort block. In this case, of course, it's going to sort it by number. So what we're looking at in our loop here is for each entity in a sorted entity list of all components in the root component folder. So we're going to start iterating through those entities. Now we're going to step inside that loop, and we're going to talk about the first of a key method in terms of getting data. Okay, and that method is called getAttributeValueString. So we are on one of the entities in the loop. Entity has this method, getAttributeValueString. We simply pass in the name of the attribute of interest, and that is going to return us that attribute's data. We're going to repeat that exact same call. Entity get attribute value string name. We're going to do it again. Entity get attribute value string description. Now, the interesting thing about this get attribute value string method, which again is present on an entity, is it gets the data for that attribute regardless of that attribute's type. Of course, I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with Genesis. The attributes are of different types. You know, some are rich text, some are Boolean, state, true, false. Some are date time, some are lists, some are straight string entries. So the interesting thing about this method, get attribute value string, is regardless of the attribute's type, it's going to give you that attribute's value as a standard string. Now, get attribute value string works across any attribute, anywhere in the model, whether it's a base attribute from Vitec or whether it's been extended. So full access to any attribute in the model. Okay? And we have fetch number, name, and description from our entity. Okay, second key method here, and that is how we traverse relationships. Okay, we see once again on entity, we have a method called get relationship target. That's fairly intuitive. And we simply give it in a plain string the name of the relation of interest. Okay, so we call entity get relationship target. That is once again going to return us an entity list. My variable name is simply targets list. That's simply another entity list of all those targets. And the next thing we're going to do, once again, numeric sort block. Let's put him to work. Numeric sort block, sort entities, pass in that entity list of targets that we just fetched. And that's going to return us a sorted target list. And that's really it. The last line within the loop is simply saving off that data so we have a structure to display it in the next screen of our API app, which is just going to be a grid displaying this data. Okay, so you may have intuited by now. We just used two methods here. Get relationship target, simply give me the name of that relation. That method right there allows us to completely traverse an entire model using relationships. We can traverse the entire model that way. And as we traverse, by using our other key method here, get attribute value string, for any entity we encounter as we're traversing relationships, we can get the value of any of their attributes across the model by simply passing in the name of the attribute of interest. Okay? So that's all we really need to do here. When we exit the loop, last line of code here has nothing to do with the API. That's simply loading up the next screen in our API app, which is going to display this data that we've just gathered in a standard grid. Okay? Let's go ahead and do that. We are going to head back into our API application running in the foreground. First thing we're going to do is display some data. Let's click that display button, 3, 2, 1. And there we go. We've gone out to our Genesis service we're connected to, gathered those components in the root component folder, gathered that number, name, and description attribute. And we've also gone out there and gotten each target of those entities and built from relation and listed them here. It's a little bit straightforward there. Very powerful with just a couple methods. Next, let's go ahead and start updating some data in our model. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create some data. Let's take a look at our create button, the event handler for that. So I'm going to hide our get and display data method. Let's hop up here to our create button click handler. Here's where we're going to create stuff. So the first thing we see here to create entities is, once again, we're going to go through a folder. Exact same call that we just saw in our display entities method. We're going to go to our hardworking project object here. It has a method called get folder. Simply give me the name of the folder, the root folder you want access to. and that's going to return that folder as a programmatic object. Get project get folder, give me the name of the folder, and we're good to go. Next call down here. Once again, we're going to head into our project object, our root data point for a project, and we're going to call create entity. Project says, great, you want me to create an entity? Give me the folder you want me to create it in, and give me the name of the entity that you want me to name it. This call right here has now added an entity to your model, okay? And it's returned that entity to us in case we want to, programmatically access or do more with the entity. Okay, we just created a new entity in the model. Now we're going to run through that exact same series of calls, and we're going to create a second entity called component X1. I'm going to create that because the next step, we're going to go ahead and relate those together and demonstrate how we create relationships. Okay, so in this case, we don't want to create this entity in the root components folder. We want to create it in that built from subfolder that we saw. So the way we do that, folder right now represents our root component folder. We want to access the subfolder in it. So we simply access its children collection. Okay, great. Give me the name of the subfolder you want to fetch. And just like that, we have reset our folder local variable here to the built from subfolder. Okay, back to the exact same call to create an entity. Project create entity. Great. Give me the folder you want me to create it in, which is going to imply class, if you will. So give me the folder you want me to create it in. Give me the name of the entity you want me to name it. So project create entity, that is now created that entity in our project and returned it for programmatic access if needed. Okay, so we've created two entities here, component X, component X1. Let's go ahead and relate them together. So how do we create relationships? First thing we need to do is we need to get the relation definition of interest. We, of course, need to know what kind of relationship to establish. And we're going to do that by, once again, heading into our project object. We're going to bounce up to the schema for the project. So we bounce up the schema, and that gives us access to all our schema side objects. And schema has a method called get relationship definition. Fine, give me the name, just a simple string. Give me the name of the relation you want to fetch. And there we go. We have now returned a relation definition object that we can work with for other items. Okay, so we're going to take that relation definition back to our hardworking project object here. We're going to call against project. It has a method called create relationship. Well, that's great. Project says, I'm going to do this for you. What relation do you want me to use to relate two entities? And then what two entities do you want me to relate? Okay, so there's our two new entities that we created, and we're going to relate these together via built from, built-in relationship definition. So there we go. That's all it takes to create new entities, and that's all it takes to create relationships across our models. Okay, last thing we're going to do is we're going to head back into our get and display data method to reflect or show the changes to the model we're about to make with these creates. And then we're simply going to check our checkbox on our API app screen. Okay, so once again, I'm going to pull up the main Genesis client in the background, API application running in the foreground, and we're about to create a component as well as a target component. So before we create, we may want to keep our eyes up here on the root component folder, because we are about to create an entity in there, and we should see the main Genesis client respond to that creation. So here we go. Let's create some data in 3, 2, 1, create. And so there we go. In the main Genesis client, we saw that new entity come in because it was created in the model. We saw that main client respond to that. And in our GUI, our API application, our grid now reflects our two entities, component X. We created component X 1 second, and then related them together So it shows up in our built from target for our new component X. Okay, so we've now created some stuff. Let's go ahead and update some stuff. Let's update some data. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at our update button, take a look at the software for that. So back to Visual Studio, and let's look at our update button. Go ahead and hide our create method. Here we are on update button click. Take a look at that. Okay, the first thing we need to do to update an entity is, well, we need to get that entity. Okay, so we're going to work once more with our very hard-working project object here. We're going to call a method called getEntity. Project says, great, I'll get an entity for you. Just give me the name of the entity you want me to fetch. And that's all we need to do. Project's going to return that entity to us, so we have programmatic access for it. Okay, well, we want to update some attributes on this entity now. Let's see how we do an update to attribute. Well, on our entity, we have a method called getAttribute, which is going to return us the raw attribute object, or getAttributeValueString, which just returns the data as a string. In this case, we want access to the actual raw attribute object. So getAttribute, fine. What's the name of the attribute you want to fetch? Against that attribute, we simply call setValue. And in this case, we are going to set the value of the number attribute to 100. Okay, so getAttribute, number, setValue to 100. We are then going to repeat that exact same process for the description attribute. Entity, getAttribute, this time description, set value to a description of component X. And that's all it takes. We have now updated our entity attribute values here. We've now updated the number and description attribute. Now we've changed the data in the entity. The last thing we do, call an update method. Entity has this method called update. So after we change the data in an entity, we simply call update against it. That's going to push it back up onto the service, the Genesis service we're connected to, and then on into the database for saving. So bang, that's all we need to do to update any attribute across the model with any desired value. Last thing we're going to do, we're outside the API. Once again, we simply want to call our get and display data method to reflect the changes to our entities that we're about to update. Okay, so once again, main Genesis client in the background. I'm going to pull up the API application running in the foreground. And again, we may want to keep our eyes up here on the root component folder content and take a look at component X because we're about to update its number attribute. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Update button, 3, 2, 1, click. And so there we go. In our main Genesis client, we see that its number attribute has been updated. Genesis client has responded to that. And in our API application, we see the update to our attributes. Numbers updated to 100. Description's been updated to a description of component X. Okay, so we've gone in and we've updated some model data. We now have an engineer coming over to our desk, raging and yelling at us and banging on the desk for mucking with his model. So let's go ahead and clean that stuff up. Let's clean up that data that we just created. So let's take a look at delete functionality with our delete button. So I'm going to go ahead and hop back into our software here, back into Visual Studio, and we are going to hide our update method, and instead go ahead and take a look at our delete button click handler here. Well, delete's pretty easy. If we want to delete an entity, once again, the first thing we need to do is get that entity from the project, just as we saw, exact same call that we saw in our update method. So from our hardworking project object, once again, we are going to go project, simply call getEntity. Give me the name of the entity you're interested in, and that is going to return us that entity, so we have programmatic access to it and can work with it as needed. Now, entity has a method called delete. is, of course, going to go ahead and delete that entity. A little bit self-explanatory there. So once we get here and once we fetch that entity and call delete against it, it is now gone from the model. So it's gone poof, no longer existing in the model. We are going to go ahead and make that exact same call to fetch our component X1 we created earlier, which we related to component X. Let's go ahead and get that one. Exact same call, project get entity. Give me the name of the entity you like, you need access to. That's going to return us that entity. Once again, we are going to leverage our entity delete method. Once that executes, that entity is now gone from the model. Okay, last thing we're going to do, yet again, is call our get and display data method to reflect the changes to the model that we just made. So let's go ahead and do that. Once again, main Genesis client in the background, API application in the foreground. Again, we may want to keep our eye up here on our components in our root component folder because component X is no longer long for this world. We are about to delete it, and we should see the main Genesis client respond to that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and hit the delete button. 3, 2, 1, delete. And there we go. So we saw the main client reflect that deletion, respond to that deletion, and in our API application grid, we see our grid no longer contains component 1, component X1. They've been deleted. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now, the last thing we want to do is be good stewards of our software and ensure we have a good, clean exit from the repository that we've logged into. Let's go ahead and take a look at our login code, our login button software. So back into Visual Studio. Here we go. I'm going to hide our delete method. And let's pop down here to a Windows closing event. Now we're going to do this on Windows closing. We have a login button click event, okay, which is going to close the window, which is going to kick off this Windows closing event. And the way we do things that way is someone may just hit the X button up here, okay, versus the logout button. So if you click the X button to initiate the dialog close, the Windows closing event is still going to fire. And here's our handling for that. Okay, to make a clean log out, a clean exit from the repository, back to our root project object, we're going to move up to the repository that contains it, and it contains a method called logout, and that's all we need to execute. We've now logged out from that Genesis service, from that Genesis installation. There's one more thing we're going to do, and that is we're going to call a standard .NET method called dispose, and what that's going to do is clean up any unmanaged resources, if you will, that are still lying around in memory. It's going to clean all that stuff up. So project, repository, logged out, project, repository, dispose, and we've now made a clean exit from a Genesis install, cleaned up anything lying around in memory. Let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click our logout button, 3, 2, 1, log out. And we've now made a clean exit from our Genesis installation we were connected to, and our API app has closed down. Okay, so I am going to hop back into our slides here. Here we go. And let me get my arrow here because it bugs me to death when it's coming in and out. Okay, so there we go. I've gone through some key methods there in the API set of methods and properties. Again, I know I went through it pretty quick, but again, the idea was to kind of, rather than programmatic instruction, the idea was kind of provide you all with a conceptual sense of what's possible there. And hopefully we saw that by hitting just a couple key techniques and methods in that API. And frankly, we didn't look at a whole lot of code there, but using those methods, we can do a whole lot of stuff. We can completely traverse a model via relationships across the entire model, and we can get the data from any attribute in that model, regardless of class, regardless of attribute type. So we can do a whole lot with a little bit there. Okay, well, that's all I really have in terms of an intro session. We can certainly get into subsequent webinars if you all are interested in that. Please, friends, please feel free to send us some feedback on that. If you'd like to see more in-depth discussions of the API, perhaps particular unique topics within the API, please, by all means, feel free to send that, and we'll incorporate that in our planning. There's no way we could cover the breadth of the API in a single shot here, but hopefully you at least have now at least a decent conceptual understanding of what's possible out there in terms of integrating data across your own organization using Genesis data. Okay, well, I get it's a big topic. If there's any questions out there or any specific topics you'd like us to clarify, please feel free to fire away. I also want to add, we are lucky to have Lou Priolo on the line. Lou is Vitech's Director of Product Development, and he is one of the original architects of Genesis, if not the primary architect of Genesis. And he's a real wizard with the bits and bytes of it. So I think between the two of us, we can probably handle any questions or clarifications that are needed. So Alan, back to you. If there's any questions that have come up, we're happy to take a look at them.
Thanks, Andy. We've received a few questions, so thanks to all of our participants. I encourage you to join the discussion right now and submit your questions if you haven't already using your webinar control panel. Our first question comes from Jeff, and I think it is something that you did cover, but maybe it's good to refresh everybody. What license do you need to run an API application?
Okay, well, I'm personally not the best one on the licensing side, though I've certainly touched on it a little bit. Lou, you might be able to articulate that a little better than me. You want to discuss that a little bit? How licensing works in regards to an API?
Sure, I'll take that one. So, I mean, effectively, a Genesis license is required to be accessible from wherever you're running the Genesis API, wherever you're accessing the Genesis API in your application. So if you've installed Genesis and licensed it and can run Genesis locally, you have everything that you need to run the Genesis API on that machine. Now, there may be cases where you may want to consume the Genesis API on a server somewhere or another machine where Genesis is not installed. And in that case, there will need to be a Genesis license either installed locally on that machine or accessible from that machine somewhere on the network. And that's basically it. The Genesis API does require a Genesis license.
All right, excellent. Thanks for that. We had another question come through from Janana, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that properly, but the question was, can we get access to the sample that was demoed today? And I'll just go ahead and let everybody know that the webinar is being recorded right now, so this will be available on our website within the next day or so, so everybody will have access to this demonstration that Andy went through. The next question regarding the API that we have is from Rachel, and this question says, which languages can you use when making your API application?
Okay, so there's two questions, if I understood you correctly.
No, the only question that is directed to y'all is, which languages can you use in making your application? Okay.
So as we saw in the getting started section or topic, Genesis is a Microsoft .NET 4.0 product. So of course we're going to build a .NET application to access the Genesis, use the API to access the Genesis service. So you use any standard .NET language. That's almost primarily either Visual Basic .NET, VB.NET, or C#. So you could use either in your API application to communicate with the Genesis API to create an application. Just a .NET language, VB.NET or C#.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And another question that we have is coming from Bob. And Bob asks, how do you know which methods are available for use when making your API application?
Sure. There's a couple techniques for that. One is with the API in Visual Studio, you have full IntelliSense support. So if you're looking at any type that you've created, for instance, that project object that we kept working with, you can simply hit dot standard Visual Studio IntelliSense. It's going to pop up, and that's one way to do it. Is you can kind of browse methods and properties available to each of our types that way. Beyond that, there is some API documentation out there, which you can get to from your Genesis installation. Start Genesis documentation. There is API documentation in there. The third way you can do it is if you're running Genesis. Is my screen still showing, Alan?
Your screen is still showing. Yes, we're still on the questions page.
Still showing. Okay, so here's my Genesis client over here. Okay, that's going to launch documentation, and down here we do have an API reference that you can access to browse through the various methods and properties. This exact same help app is available from your start menu. Browse your Genesis directory in your start menu, and you can launch the exact same thing, and that gives us, an API reference.
Excellent. I got another question that came in from Daniel, who was asking if the API is documented, but it seems that you just went over that right now. With that said, I don't have any other questions at this time. I'll give it another moment to see if anybody has any other questions that funnel through. We'll just see if there are any more for you guys. Otherwise, we'll move into the closing.
I do have a question. This is Lou again from Vitech, and a question for you, Andy. In addition to the webinar being recorded today, would it be possible to provide customers who are interested the actual sample that you worked with? Could we put that on our website or send that to customers? I think that is maybe what the previous customer was asking there about having access to the actual code that you demonstrated today.
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely no problem with that. It does work with an associate. The API app that we looked at is set up to specifically address, our project that I created here. So it would be a matter of making the API project available, as well as a backup of our project. So to use it, you'd simply import our API sample project into Genesis, and then you can light up your the API app. I don't see a problem with that. Just as a side note on that, this one, we're about to release 5.0 Service Pack 2. This is written against the SP2 code. There'd be almost no differences in the API app code that we just looked at, but I'd have to just do a quick sanity check to ensure that I haven't leveraged anything that's been added in 5.0 Service Pack 2 if you're using a previous instance of Genesis. But I don't see a problem with that. Yeah, it'd be handy.
Great, thank you. So if you are interested in that, feel free to shoot an email to support@vitechcorp.com and we'll get you a copy.
Excellent. Yeah, that was another question from another customer as well. So yeah, addressing and getting them the code was exactly what they were looking for. I've got another couple questions that came trickling in. One question is from Daniel, and it is, do you have any VB.NET examples?
We do not. Well, yes and no. Our scripting environment, Genesis scripts, are written in VB.NET, as well as our report script. So if we look at Genesis scripts for report scripts for all of our reports, you will see VB.NET in action. The method calls are exactly the same. They're just some syntactical differences between Visual Basic.NET and C#. We use C# for development of Genesis, and just speaking for myself, when I'm writing reports or report scripts, or I'm writing Genesis scripts, I do sometimes keep open there's a website out there. I forget the name of it, but it's a VB.NET C# converter, so you can enter C# code on one side, and it'll give you the VB.NET equivalent on the other side. So if we do have examples, you can take a look at the some of our scripts and some of our reports. Let me show you one real quick. Let's look at TeamView. Okay, the TeamView script, if you use TeamView, that generates all these web pages that represent a project. All of this code is using VB.NET, okay? And you'll see access to some of the exact same methods that we just used. So here's a whole batch code, among others we have, where we're leveraging VB.NET access to the API. But it's important to remember that the API methods are the same. It doesn't matter what the language is. If we fetch an entity and some VB.NET code, entity is going to have get attribute value string. That doesn't change across language.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm not seeing any other questions come in as of now, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&A for today's presentation. If you have any other questions or comments for Andy, don't hesitate to shoot him an email. You can see his email address on that closing screen. So Andy, if you want to switch back to that closing slide, there you go. There's his contact information. Or you can send a message to support@vitechcorp.com, and I'll make sure to get that over to him. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Please keep an eye on your inbox for more webinar invitations over the next few weeks. We also keep our online calendars updated with our upcoming webinars, and that's located on our website. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. And that's all for today. Once again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.